Hi everybody, this is Jennifer with Nook-A-Lickle Creations, and I'm going to show you how to make this glow-in-the-dark Deathly Hallows storyboard. Now I sand, prep, and spray paint the base of my tumbler. In this case I used Rust-Oleum flat white, and I also taped off the top and the bottom with electrical tape to protect the cup from the epoxy, because I tend to make a mess with that stuff. But I've got 10 milliliters of Mr. Nulla's Glitter Speed Dry, and some of their UV mica. I chose one that didn't have any color so that the background can stay basically white, but this glows a really bright blue. Now if you look at the paint job, you'll notice that some spots are thinner than others. This was done on purpose so that it can add some dimension when I add the smoke after this layer of epoxy. You don't have to do that, I just like the way it looks. And you're just going to apply the epoxy like you do on any tumbler. Get a good coat, but try to keep it thin, because the thinner the coats, the more space you have for your fluid and glitter when you put this together. I use a heat gun to pop any bubbles and get rid of any lines from putting the epoxy on, and let it cure for about 3 hours. Smoke effect is a really good and easy way to get some dimension. All you need is a cheap utensil and an open flame from a candle. Burn the utensil and you get smoke. Now I wiggle that knife just to get a little bit of movement. I find that I like the effect of that. And the closer to the flame, the darker the spots that you're gonna get. The further away, the more kind of wispy. But you're gonna just put as much smoke on there as you'd like. I like some pretty full coverage from top to bottom because I can never figure out exactly where the design is gonna end. The most important thing is that once you're done with the smoke effect, you're going to want to seal it. I use Rust-Oleum clear matte to seal it. I haven't tried anything else, but it works really well, and then I let that dry before I move into the next step. I let my clear coat dry for about 20 minutes, and now I'm ready to put on my next layer of epoxy. This is 8 to 10 milliliters of Speed Dry, and there's no additive in this layer of epoxy. We're just going for a nice thin coat to protect the smoke that we put on there. Now I forgot to retape my top, and I noticed some epoxy pooling up there kind of by the rim, so I just used my fingernail and drug it back down. And once I get this applied, I'm going to let it cure for another 2 to 3 hours. Now that that layer of epoxy has cured, grab a craft knife and start running it underneath that lip. You may not be able to see any stuck in there, but I promise you there's going to be some. So just very carefully, please don't stab yourself, run that craft knife around that lip and get any bits of epoxy that have dried inside there. Even the smallest little bit of epoxy can keep that outer plastic shell from sitting in there properly, which can cause issues with leakage, or it may not sit in there quite straight and then you've got a leaning cup. I've done it before. It's not exactly pretty. It still works. The cup still works, but not really pretty. So very carefully use your craft knife to get all of the epoxy out of there. Now, if you get more in there than you meant to, or there's some really stubborn spots, take your heat gun and heat the outer rim of the cup. Now, be careful. Obviously, that rim is going to get really hot. So be safe when you do it, but run that heat gun around the edge, and then it should loosen up that epoxy enough for you to be able to get your craft knife under there to get it out. And this is probably one of the more important parts of building a storyboard, because if there's any in that lip, it will cause a problem. Once you think you've got all the epoxy out of that rim, go ahead and grab the outer shell and give it a test run. Make sure it sits in there completely and straight. You can feel for the seam of the plastic part. If you know you're good, you can move on to the next spot. If not, go back and try again with the craft knife. But I'm using the Loctite Extreme Glue. I tried this on a cup a couple of days ago, and I really want to like it. I really want to like it. The fact that you can let it sit for 15-20 minutes and then you're good to go to the next part really makes me happy. But my first attempt did not go so great. I wound up with some leaking. So I decided to give it another go, and here I am. I did find that I didn't have quite enough hand strength to get the glue out comfortably. It was a struggle. I'm definitely on the struggle bus getting the glue into the rim there. You see me fighting it and trying, but it does work. So I definitely recommend it. But I got the glue in there and I started trying to see if I was missing any spots. Just kept putting more and more in there. Honestly, I probably have more than I need in there. So I grabbed one of my little skewers from Dollar Tree and I started using that to move the glue around. But the goal here is to make sure that you've got even coverage. Now normally I just use my speed dry. I use like 8 milliliters. I pour it in there, and the nice thing about epoxy is you can heat it up and, you know, turn the cup around, kind of like what I'm doing with the glue here, and it'll go everywhere you need it to go. Let it sit for a minute flat and it will do the self-leveling thing. Obviously the glue isn't going to work exactly the same, so I had to manipulate it more significantly, which was kind of a pain, but again, kind of worth it for the sake of being able to move on 20 minutes later instead of 2 to 3 hours or longer, depending on the epoxy that you use. And I think I've about got it now. And so I'm gonna grab the shell and place it in there. And I'm making sure that it's seated. I pull the tape off of the threads because I'm going to use the bottom to hold everything down and straight. I decided it might be a good idea to rotate once it's been in the glue, kind of make sure, shift things around, and then I just put the bottom on, tighten it up, and that will hold it in place and keep any movement from happening so that I know it's drying right where it's supposed to be. So I've waited about 30 minutes and now I'm going to start pouring in my liquid. I use saline contact solution and glycerin if I want to slow down the flow. I had some left over from another cup, so I poured that in. Now I'm just filling it up with plain contact solution so that I can get my measurement. Trying real hard not to go over the top. I do anyway. But I'm going to pour that into the cup so that I have the right amount. And then I'm going to add some glycerin. Now, the more glycerin that you add, the slower your glitter is going to flow. I tend to like to keep the movement going pretty quick, so I don't add a lot, maybe a teaspoon, but you could always add more. And you're just going to stir this up. It'll go cloudy and then it'll go clear again. When it's clear, it's ready to pour in. I mixed it off camera, so sorry about that. But when it goes back to clear, you're just gonna pour that in. I always pour in some fluid first. I go about 3/4 of the way and then I start adding glitter so that the glitter doesn't clump. I got some Deathly Hallows. Their silver holographic is the color I went with from Mr. Nola's Glitter. And I'm just gonna pour a little bit in there, get a small handful and put it in the cup. And then I add some glow-in-the-dark stars that I also got from Mr. Nola's Glitter. Thank you for that, Rachel. She got them for me. I was very excited. And you're just going to start putting those in. I push them down off the ledge and over that edge. I swirl to kind of test the flow, make sure it's not clumping up real bad, and I try to get it all down into the fluid as best as I can. I decided to add a black chunky mix because it looked a little too plain to me, and you can add anything that you want or leave it exactly as it was, but I thought it would look good with this chunky mix. Now I ruined the label on this one, so I'm not really sure who I got it from. It might be Sass & Crafts. It could be, although I don't think it is. I know I have another black from the glitter guy, but I think this is Sass & Crafts. I am sure you can find something like that everywhere. But I'm gonna speed up the rest of this because I'm just adding more glitter. Once you've added all the glitter that you want to add, go ahead and fill it up the rest of the way, and you're trying to get it just under where that lip is, but of course I went over. But that's okay, we'll fix that here in a minute. But tapping will help get the glitter down, and I swirl it a bit, tap it, and I'm going to use that excess fluid that's over the edge there. I'm going to use that to help me pull any glitter that's on that flat spot over the edge and into the cup itself. I don't like to waste glitter, so whenever I can, I get as much down in the cup as I possibly can. So I do this for a little bit. I grab a paper towel to soak up that extra and dry off that flat part of the stainless steel, because it needs to be dry for the silicone. Unfortunately, I put it down in the side of the cup a little bit and I soaked up more than I should have. And you'll see here in a minute, the fluid level is now a lot lower than I wanted it to be. So I did add more and bring it back up, but I didn't save the footage of that for some reason. But once you've got it where you want it and everything's dried off, get your silicone and run a bead along the edge there. You want to make sure that it's touching the plastic shell and that flat surface of the stainless steel. Be careful not to push too far or too hard, because if you do, you'll put it down into the side of the cup, and the goal is to create a dam without actually going into the side of the cup. It'll help with certain designs. Some designs you'll see that if it goes too far down. On this one, it really wouldn't matter, but I wanted you to see how I do it, and just try to get it to where it's basically just on the surface. So I take a popsicle stick and I smooth it all out, kind of like spreading butter or maybe even icing a cupcake. And I do it at an angle so that it's touching the stainless steel and then going up to the edge. And again, I'm using a light hand so that I don't push it down into the side of the cup. Now, any of the silicone that goes up over that lip, or if any gets on the outside of the cup, it can prevent you from being able to put that bottom piece on, to screw the bottom on. So you're going to want to make sure that you wipe that all down before you finish. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm just wiping off all that excess. And then I let it dry, usually overnight, but it usually gets dried in maybe 3 to 4 hours. I just usually get to this point at night, and then when I get up in the morning, this is what you get. And I let it sit right side up to test and make sure that there's no leaks. And then you should do a dry fit. You should test to make sure that that bottom goes on before you move on to this stage. Because if there's anything going on with the silicone, any obstruction, and you've got glue on this, you're now stuck with whatever you've got. So test it first. Don't do what I just did. Make sure it sits properly and screws on and all the seams are good, and then you can go ahead and add the glue. And again, I'm using the Loctite glue. I put it on the insides of the threads on the bottom cap, and now I'm running it along the outside of the plastic shell where that edge of the lid will sit, that outer rim. And I'm just going to spread it around with my skewer to make sure I've got good coverage. And again, this glue will dry in like 15-20 minutes, which is really nice. So I screwed the lid on, or well, technically the bottom on, and I'm gonna let that sit. And while that's sitting, I'm gonna go ahead and work on the vinyl. Do yourself a favor, make sure you clean off any excess glue that's around that seam so that you don't wind up with textures that you don't want underneath your spray paint. And of course I glued myself, so I had to get the glue off me. But now it's time for the vinyl. In this case, I am going to use the vinyl as a stencil. And the edges are squared off, so I'm just cutting that off so you get more of a seamless design. And get my contact paper on there. And now I've lost my scissors. Took me a second to find those, and I wound up having to use the tiny little Cricut ones. But, you know, it's not crafting if you don't lose something. But now I'm just pulling the backing off. I'm sorry I'm a little out of frame here, but I'm sure you've done this before. So, you know, I like to do it upside down like this so that when the edges stick up like that, I can just push it down and get it to adhere to the contact paper. Now that your vinyl is ready to go, you just figure out your placement. Now Death's wings are pretty tall, so I want to make sure I leave enough room for a drip. And I just start smoothing the vinyl over the cup. It really doesn't matter about wrinkles and bubbles and things like that. You don't have to be extra careful here. Just get the vinyl on the cup. That's all that really matters. And start removing your transfer paper. Now, as you're doing this, just be careful of the smaller pieces, like the edges there. I have ripped my vinyl before by accident. So just be careful. And as you're going around, just push it down onto the cup. Get rid of that transfer paper, and now you can start smoothing down your vinyl. Again, don't worry about those wrinkles and bubbles, just make sure you're going around the edge of the design so that it's good and adhered. So when you spray paint, none of the paint will go up underneath that vinyl, and you'll get a nice crisp line. Now while I was doing this, I realized that one of those wrinkles did go through the brother's arm. That was unfortunate, but it's a pretty easy fix. Just grab a craft knife, and I trimmed out some of the vinyl there and gave him back his arm. Just be careful when you're using a craft knife or even a weeding tool on that plastic, because if you put in a deep enough scratch, the epoxy may not hide it. Really minor scratches, you'll never see it under the epoxy. And then where the two designs meet at the edges, there was a sharp angle there, so I just did a wavy line to finish up, make it look all continuous. And you should wind up with something like this. I use Rust-Oleum Flat Black to spray paint the cup. I do it outside in my backyard. Make sure you're in a well-ventilated space if you're going to spray paint inside. And I started removing the vinyl. Now, I'm using a weeding pen. Just, again, be careful. You don't want to scratch the plastic, but you also don't want to scratch your paint. But carefully, just remove the vinyl. Take your time, don't rush, and get all of those pieces. Don't forget the little pieces, which keep sticking to my fingers. I swear I find bits of vinyl all over the place. Now, my paint takes quite a while to dry. A lot of times I'll leave it overnight because I live in Middle Tennessee where it's super humid and in an old house that doesn't keep the humidity out. So I usually let mine just dry overnight, but make sure the paint is dry before you start removing the vinyl. So now it's time to do the drips, and I use black glue sticks. My glue gun has two settings. I like to use the high setting, mainly because I have zero patience. But I just run the hot glue along the edge. Now here you see where the drip was getting kind of close to Death's wings, so I just turned the cup upside down to keep it from going too far. And I work my way around the cup, letting it drip as it goes, and just following that edge. Now, in the event you get some glue like on that very top part, wait until it cools down and you can trim it with your craft knife, and then grab a heat gun and it will smooth it back out. It won't have that cut look anymore. If you wanted to add more, you could do the same thing. Do another layer, use your heat gun, and it'll help it all meld together instead of looking like multiple layers, which is something that I've done as well. But you just run that hot glue around the edge and let it cool off, and then you're ready for a coat of epoxy. I'm using about 18 mil of speed dry, again from Mr. Nola's Glitter, and I am obsessed with the rainbow alcohol ink from Marabou. If I have a solid black on a tumbler, I am probably going to add that rainbow alcohol ink. So I put a couple of drops into my epoxy, and now I am just applying that to the cup. I start up towards the top, just underneath where the drips are, and work my way down. I like to do thinner layers. This cup is already a little thicker than a regular tumbler, so I find doing thinner layers, I can usually finish up with 2 thin layers and keep that thickness down. But if you have to do a 3rd layer, because you have to do sanding in between or something like that, it really helps keep that thickness under control. And I'm just applying this epoxy. After I worked it down and got the butt, then I ran up underneath the drips and then on top of the drips. And then I use my finger and follow the lines of the drips and up at the top. And when you're working on those drips, you can see me doing it here. Well, I'm kind of blocking it, sorry about that. But I run my finger up underneath those drips and I work it quite a bit. This way I can get any air bubbles that are in it out, and I can make sure that I've got all of those drips completely covered on the edges. The epoxy likes to pull there too, so I'm trying to pull that down. But then I just use a heat gun to smooth that all out and get rid of any air bubbles. You can use a tap method if you've got some streaks in there from applying the epoxy, but I find that the heat gun really does work pretty well. And I'll do this, I'll let it cure, sand, do whatever I need to do there, and then I'll apply a 2nd coat, and the tumbler is done. I just love this tumbler. I mean, okay, I'm a Harry Potter fan, so maybe I'm biased, but I think it's just beautiful in its simplicity. It's got a little bit of bling from the glitter and the alcohol ink, but simple. Until now, look at that glow. I mean, it is so bright. And I think it's exactly what this tumbler needed. It's just kind of a surprising wow factor and put it just over the top. Thank you so much for joining me for my very first tutorial. I really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe. Feel free to share. Everything that I used will be down in the description below. And I'd like to invite you to our brand new Facebook group. I hope that this video helped you. Maybe if you're intimidated by storyboards, it got you past it and now you'll give it a try. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You guys have a great day and I will see you soon.